Hey, hey, good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. This is Jeremiah, and we are going to have a fantastic little webinar here. I see a great group of people here, and to all you watching the recorded version, which will be available just a few hours after we're done wrapping up here. Hello to you in the future. Got a couple quick housekeeping items for you people here watching and interacting live. The very top of your screen, myself, I like to click that view options drop down and exit the full screen mode just if I need to get to an important email or something while watching the webinar. And just do familiarize yourself with the Q and A button there in the upper left. Get that all ready to type in your questions. I'm sure you'll have some good questions. This is going to be a really fun webinar. So a lot of fun putting together with Paul. And we're going to show some cool techniques. I think that's about all I have to say. So I'm going to go ahead and get this pushed over to Paul.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Hope you all are enjoying your Friday so far. Today we will be going through some techniques in Photoshop and in SketchUp for creating a presentation video to show off a space. There we go. My name is Paul, and I have been working with Photoshop for many years, and a lot of people aren't aware that it has some basic animation features. So I thought it would be fun to show off some of these features today, and then how what you can do in Photoshop can be tied into a basic SketchUp animation. So here's the outline for the day. First, we will go into Photoshop and set up a timeline and work with some keyframes so that you can move your layers around and create an animation. Then we will be setting up some scenes in SketchUp to export an animation there. And then finally, we will combine these two pieces of video in a basic video editing program. And before we jump into Photoshop, let's figure out what we're going to do here. I already have a SketchUp model prepared, and as you can see down here at the lower right, and what I want to do for the scene is start inside this building. I want to have some doors animate and open up, and so opening us up to the outside area, and then we're going to walk out onto the patio and check out some of the furnishings displayed here and give you a nice demonstration of the site at a human scale. So before we get started in Photoshop, what we're going to need is an initial frame from the animation in SketchUp. So I will demonstrate how to grab that real quick. And then also I have a PNG image of some sliding glass doors that I found on the internet. You're going to want a PNG for anything that has windows because that file format will preserve transparencies so that we can actually look through the windows when working with it. So let's move into SketchUp to grab that initial scene here. So here's my basic SketchUp model that I have, and the way animating works in SketchUp is you set up various camera positions called scenes, and you can save those camera positions and then fill in basically frames in between each scene. SketchUp will do that automatically. And since we're going to be starting down at the building here, looking at the patio, we want to make sure that our initial scene or camera position is the same for the animation as it is for the frame that we use in Photoshop. So the way that I'm going to grab this is I'm going to first place the camera down on the ground. I like to go to camera and position camera. It gives you this little man icon here. And you can basically just place this on any surface in the model, and it will drop down to eye height on that surface. And down here at the lower right-hand corner, you can adjust the height there. So I'm 6 feet tall, so I will just hit 6 foot, enter. and that'll raise up just ever so slightly. Upon being placed on the ground, you can look around the model with this eye icon and just clicking the left mouse button and moving the mouse. But I want to position myself so that I'm actually within this little building block here, looking out at the patio. I'm going to go up to camera and walk, and it gives you these little this little feet symbol here, and with that you can click and then move the mouse up to walk forward, or move the mouse backwards to walk back. So you can kind of position yourself in the model without leaving the height as if you were standing there. So I'm just going to go forward and position myself as if I was in the building looking outward. Using the middle mouse click, you can look around the model with the eye there. So that's pretty close. For these purposes, I'm not going to be too precise on it since I already have this image saved, but that's just how I position the camera initially. And then once I have the position just right, I save the scene. There's a couple ways you can do this, but I'll show you this way. Just go up to Window and open up your Scenes Manager here. And just in this manager, you have some options for setting up the scene. These are the different items that will be saved into the scene. We definitely want to make sure that camera location is saved, but then I like to also save all of these other options for the presentation purposes. And then I'll just click the plus button to add the scene, and it saves it right there. Of course, we want to have scene 1 saved as that. So anyways, here's our scene 1 that I picked initially. And I'm going to make sure that I keep this scene 1 saved, because when we go ahead and do our animation, we're going to start here and put different scenes in, just so that the Photoshop animation will match up perfectly with this location. So once we have this set up, we just want to go to File in SketchUp and click on Export, and then export a 2D graphic. And this will allow you to save the image into the place of your choosing. But I've already done that, so I don't need to actually save that image. And then we can move into Photoshop. Now in Photoshop, we want to create a new document. And since we're working with film, I like to stick with the film and video presets here. Depending on what version of Photoshop you have, this interface may look a little different, but they all do have this film and video presets here. So I'm going to just stick with the 1920 by 1080 pixel aspect ratio here, and I'm just going to up the resolution for good measure. And so we want to make sure that we're using a correct aspect ratio here. So I'm going to be making my video later on in 1080p. So that's what I want to set my Photoshop canvas to upon starting. Let's close that for now. So let's put in our newly saved 2D image from SketchUp. This is the one here. I'm just going to drag and drop it in. And I just want to center this into my frame, like so. I hold down the Shift key and drag these anchor points out to get an even expansion or transformation of the image, and then I'll hit enter to place it. And now I want to place my sliding door image over the top and adjust this so that it fits appropriately within the frame. Let's do something like this. So that looks about right. Now we are looking through the doors out into the patio. Let's set up the patio so that the doors will be in focus in the initial phase, and then once the doors open up, we want the patio to become into focus, which is a neat little effect. So I'm going to first make a copy of the patio image here. I'm going to either drag this down to the new icon, or I can use Command or Control J to make a copy. And then I want to rasterize this layer and add a blur effect to it. So I'm just going to go Filter, Blur Gallery. My favorite blur effect is this Tilt Shift Blur, which allows you to pick like a focus point and then have a blur gradient. So as far as conveying depth, we have elements in focus the closer you get to the actual door, and less in focus as it extends out. Press Enter to apply the blur. Okay, so now we have our initial steps set up. Let's cut out these doors so that we can animate them and go from there. So we have our door image here. I'm going to first want to rasterize the layer so that I can actually alter the pixels within. And I'm going to use the marquee tool and just grab both the doors initially very quickly and easily like this. And then use Command or Control X to cut it from the sliding door layer. And then Command or Control V to paste it back in on a separate layer. And then I'm just going to want to place this right back where it was. Like that. Now I'm just going to rename this layer to Frame and separate the doors onto different layers. Once again, take the marquee tool, make a selection of the right door, cut and paste it back in, and place it back to where it should be. And then of course you should keep your layers named appropriately. So this is our left door and the right door. Okay, so how do we animate these layers and add movement? We're going to go up to Window in Photoshop and click on Timeline to open up our animation timeline here. And we just want to click on Create Video Timeline. If you're working with frame animation, you would create a frame animation timeline, but we are not doing that today. And then click here. And now you see we have different layers on different tracks along a timeline here. By default, it should be 5 seconds long at 29.97 frames per second. And as you can see, there's different ticks. The 10F stands for 10 frames in. So there are 10 frames in between here. And then at about 30 frames in, you have your 1 second marker. And so with this, you can add various effects to different layers over the span of this timeline. And what we're going to do initially is animate these doors to open. And so let's do the left door first. We'll click on the left door here and expand our options here. We can animate the position of the layer, the opacity of the layer, and the style of the layer. And so what we're going to do is just animate the position. And starting at about 1 second in, we want to add a keyframe. And a keyframe, they're essential to this kind of animation. They're basically just stopping points for movement. And so if you click this stopwatch icon, you'll create a keyframe at 1 second in. And then if we move the playhead to 2 seconds, we can now add another keyframe which is a stopping point. And move the door over like so. So over 1 second, it's going to move. And to play your animation in a preview, you can either press the play button here or simply the space bar. So we have 1 second of stillness and then 1 second of movement. Now the doors are on the outside of the frame. We want to put them behind the frame just by moving them below the layer there. And preview it so that it looks smooth. Okay. And once our left door is looking the way we want it to look, let's move on and do the same thing for the right door. I'm going to leave this expanded so that I can have a clear, let's move that, clear indication of where the doors start opening and end the opening sequence. So I'm going to add a keyframe here, move it over, match it up with this. And you don't actually have to press the keyframe button here once you create a keyframe and add movement. If you just add any movement like this, it should add that frame in, but it looks like it didn't. So, oh, you know what? I'm on opacity. That's what it is. So if we ever put keyframes in that we don't want, we can simply delete them. And let's actually put a position keyframe in right here, move it over. And to get a smooth, straight movement to the right, I'm just holding down the Shift key while I drag. And see, notice that I moved that layer, and so it's going to add a keyframe here at 2 seconds in. One thing you can do if you find that the timeline is getting too much in the way of your project here, hit the F key to cycle between different between a full screen and your workspace here. And on this level, you can actually use the spacebar and click and drag your canvas around. And so let's preview the animation here. Looks good. Now we want to add some focus to the patio once the doors are open. So as soon as the doors open, I want to find my blur patio image and add an opacity keyframe. And then let's say about half a second later, it comes into focus. So I'm going to actually drop down the opacity of that layer so that the one beneath can show and it's in focus. And so just like that, we have a very simple piece of animation in Photoshop. Now what we want to do is actually show the camera moving around the space. And to do that, we'll have to move into SketchUp. Before we do move into SketchUp, I do want to pause briefly to take any questions on this process so far.
No questions so far. You're killing it.
All right. Well, I guess it is pretty straightforward stuff, but like I said, a lot of people don't know that Photoshop has this capability, and it's pretty neat. So let's just move into our SketchUp model and show how we can walk around the site for an animation here. So I'm going to get rid of my scene manager because I can actually manage my scenes up in this little bar here. And I want to go back to scene 1 where I took that initial screen capture. And I want to click on my walk tool. And so since I am just going to walk around this patio, sort of meander through it, I'm going to want to create various other scenes at points in here. And I want to make sure that I create more scenes than maybe that are necessary, because the transition, basically SketchUp is going to guess based on the path between one scene to the next of what to animate. And sometimes it's not exactly smooth or how you want it to be if you have a distance of, say, 10 feet or more. So I like to do work in increments of 5 to 10 feet when I walk around a space for these purposes. So using my walk tool, I'm just going to click and move forward and just get a smooth movement like that. And then I'm going to right click here and add another scene. And so this is now scene 2. I can go back between scene 1 to check where it begins. And then if I click on scene 2, this is basically the first few dozen frames or so of the animation. Once I have scenes 2 set up, I'm just going to move around a little bit more like this. And all I'm doing is I'm just clicking and moving my mouse to move around. Maybe you want to pause here and look at the bench. I'm going to add another scene and continue along like so. Scene 4. And while I'm doing this, I want to make sure I go back and check the movement between each scene just to make sure that it is pretty smooth. So scene 3, looks like I walk right through a bench. So because of that, I'm actually going to back up a little bit, maybe just move like this. And you can update that scene by right-clicking on it and clicking on Update. So now if you check the transition between the two scenes, hopefully we walk around this bench instead of right through it. That's a lot better. And then click on scene 4. Okay. And just continue to walk around and place your camera locations, maybe right here. Oh. And maybe I want to end it right about here. So add a scene. And so we can just check the transition real quick here. Oh, works for me. So once you have all your scenes set up and you have your transitions smooth and how you want them, you'll want to make sure that you have your settings for your animation correct here. So let's go to View and click on the Animation flyout, and then click on Settings. These are some pretty basic settings, but important nonetheless. This first transition time here, that's basically the amount of time between each scene that you set up. I think by default it's 2 or 3 seconds, and so it's very quick. It doesn't feel like you're actually walking through the site if you have your scenes set up the way that I have mine. I did find that about 4 seconds between each scene at the distance that I'm placing my scenes is appropriate for walking around a site. If you do have like focal points in your space and you want to actually have the camera stop at each scene and wait for a second or two, that you can change that here. Basically slide delay time, that'll delay the amount of time that you actually stop at each scene before moving on. And so that's where these settings are. And then once you have everything set up and you want to export it into an animation, all you got to do is head up to File and click on the Export flyout and export animation. And here you just have a few options for how it's going to be exported. You want to make sure it's at MP4, that's the video format. And since I am working at that 1080p resolution at about 30 frames per second or 29.97, which is a pretty standard frame rate, I'm actually going to keep it like this, but you want to make sure that these settings are set up to how you actually plan on exporting your final video and make sure that they are matching up there. So that's actually all good. If it was different, I would change it to these settings and hit OK, and then export. And this rendering process usually does take a bit of time. So I'm actually not going to sit here and wait for that to render. I rendered one yesterday, which is essentially the same scene. And so before we move on to combining these, I was going to pause for questions on the SketchUp side of things.
A couple questions did pop in, but they're both on the Photoshop side. So
okay.
When you get a chance, we'll head up back over there.
Let's do that now. I mean, we're moving on very quickly here. So
great. The first one, Andrew asked, wouldn't you want the blurred layer to move with the doors as opposed to focusing after the doors are open?
Oh, well, I mean, that's personal preference, I suppose. Yeah, if you, I suppose you can time that so that as the doors are opening, the blur can go away.
Sure. And then we got another one in Photoshop. Is it true that you cannot select a layer to turn on or off in the timeline, but can only change the layer's opacity?
That has been my understanding. When I have had just try to get a layer to just very quickly shut off, I've just basically put my keyframes right next to each other so that the opacity change from 0 to 100 or vice versa is almost instant. So basically a 1 frame difference between 0% opacity and 100.
Super. And then one last one about SketchUp is you had checked the option to return to starting stage when you're exporting the animation. Was that intentional? Was there a reason behind that?
Okay, so all that is when it renders the video, you could either have it end on your last scene, say scene 6. So if you wanted the animation to end here, you would have that unchecked. But if you want, as you'll see in the video that I have already rendered, it'll basically go through each scene and then just return back to scene 1, so the initial position of that animation. So in theory, if you wanted to, say, walk backwards through the doors and then animate the doors shutting afterwards, you could do that.
Cool, and that was all the questions.
Okay, looks like this is going to be a short one today, but let's take a look at our 2 pieces of video that we've rendered here. So here's our doors open. Oh, it's the wrong screen. We have the first one, which is our doors opening here, and patio coming into focus. And then we have our 3D walkthrough. So we want to open up a video editing program. Here in the office, we use Camtasia. It's pretty user-friendly and pretty basic as far as video editing software goes. But a lot of these programs, like I think iMovie has the same sort of interface, and Windows Movie Maker. Basically, you have your different video tracks where you'll import video clips and then mix them together in a timeline, just kind of like the one in Photoshop. So we just want to import our media here. So let's get the doors. and the 3D walkthrough. And we're just going to place the doors right here on track 1. Press play to preview it. And one thing I did not do is set up my project. Before you do go into video editing, and pretty much any software you use, you'll want to make sure your canvas or your project frame is set up correctly. So I've been working in this resolution here, so I want to make sure that I set up my project correctly. So 1080p for a standard HD video. And that way, when I bring in my video clips, they should match up perfectly. So here we go. We have 5 seconds for doors opening and coming into focus. And then right about here is where I want to start moving through the doors. So I'm now going to take my 3D walkthrough and just place it on top. And check the transition there. Open up and movement through. Looks like there's a bit of a delay, so I'm just going to move this over ever so slightly. And since the movement through the SketchUp model starts at a forward pace, we don't really have to do much to have that transition between the frame of the door disappearing and the actual rendered video. If this didn't line up perfectly, one trick to help that transition be less obvious is most video editing software will have a fade effect. So you can add basically this track here, you can add a little fade to it and just make it very subtle. And you still get the idea that you move through the doors and walk around the site. And maybe the timing for this isn't perfect. So I'm actually going to add a clip speed to it and speed it up by maybe 1.25% or 1.25. Remove the transition. Okay, and now that we have our video clips put together, we can simply head up to save it and export the video. And let's see, where did my slideshow go? There it is. Okay, and finally we have our video. So here's the final product uploaded on YouTube. While we're letting this go, I'd like to follow up with any additional questions, if there are any, or if you want me to demonstrate something else.
We did get one. It's funny. It's the same question that I had. So Marley was just asking, is there a way to add a background image or sky? And of course, but yeah, as Paul explained to me, just trying to focus on the technique here. But obviously there absolutely isn't.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't want to try photoshopping in like a sky and have that transition into the actual SketchUp model, but certainly in SketchUp you can add your, let's see if I can get out of here, a background here. Let's see if I remember where that is. Is it styles?
Here. You're the expert.
Yeah, I don't use SketchUp that often. Let's see. So, okay, so within your styles box here, you'll want to click on this. You can add a sky to the background. Oh, and also a ground. And adjust that there. So the sky's very light. So if you click on that, you can now choose color for your sky. Let's give it a nice sky blue. Like that. And we actually don't need the ground. So when you initially set up your SketchUp models in your initial scene, you want to make sure that if you want a sky in the background, you have that turned on, so that the transition between Photoshop animation and the SketchUp animation is as smooth as possible.
Didn't want to go with my answer that it was it was an accurate sky for a very smoggy day.
Certainly, or just very snowy.
But no more questions.
Okay, well that's it. That was very simple. Let's see. That's all I really planned to show today. I was kind of hoping there's more questions. I don't know if you noticed that in my video here, I had. Oh, let's see if we can play it. I added a layer for the glass on the doors, just to have a little more idea that there's a material in between there. It's not just the door frames. So what I did for that, I can just show that real quick. I went to my left and my right door, and I just made a selection of where the glass would be, like that. And I went into my gradient tool, and I just dropped the opacity down to about 25%, maybe 20%. And from black to white, I just started with the black and dropped it down like that, just to fog up the glass a little bit to convey more of an idea that there's glass there. Maybe do it twice. And you hold down the shift key to get a straight vertical gradient. That. And you can do the same thing for the left door. The quick key for this gradient tool is G. And I'll just mimic the right door. And notice that I made changes to that layer, but the animation still affects the layers like so. I suppose if you wanted to have your patio blur go away as soon as the doors open, you can just move your keyframes around very easily, like that. And one thing that I just thought of that could make the transition a little smoother, if between moving out of the building and into this space, is you can make a copy of your frame, just Command or Control J, and kind of just do the opposite blur effect on it. Oh yeah, and then of course there's a way to I didn't think about this, to have the layer pop in automatically on your timeline. You can actually move the layer's length on the timeline so that it only appears where this begins. So let's say we move it to 3 seconds in. It's not actually going to show up in your space until that 3 seconds in. So what we can do is then add a blur. Let's just do a Gaussian blur to this. Like that. Let's find out when right about there. Let's see how that looks. The best part about Photoshop is just experimenting with all the different tools. It kind of works. But anyways, just added a blur to the frame so that as your focus moves outward, the stuff that's closer to you actually comes out of focus.
Very neat. Had one more question here. Just kind of missed it. When you generated that animation in Photoshop, how did you save that as an MP4?
Oh, right. I maybe I missed that. So you can either go down to the bottom of your timeline here and click on the little arrow icon here. Basically, it's the render video icon. And it'll bring up your different rendering options here. You'll give it a name, select a folder for it, and then select the format options that you want. There are a few. I typically just stick with the defaults. You can add frames to the that if you want to make it smoother or maybe less imposing on the processing time for whatever you're using it for. You could drop the frames down, and then you just click on render, and it'll go through and save each frame into a video. Alternatively, you can go up to File and Export, and then Render Video.
Well, very cool.
Okay, so if there are no more questions, I will just say have a good weekend, and we'll be here to answer phone calls if you do have any questions later on.
Sounds great. Goodbye.